Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui, coming to you from Singapore. With the current 15th Shangri-LA Security Dialogue well underway, the issue of South China Sea is featured prominently once again. But Professor Zheng Yongnian, director of the East Asia Institute of the National University of Singapore, says in the following interview that this region is full of dynamics in commerce and investment, and that the issue of China Sea has been exaggerated. He is critical of the lack of political wisdom and vision. How should we look at the role the United States plays in the Back to Asia strategy? And what kind of role China should play in rejuvenating the local and regional economic activities? Today, I'm very happy to be joined here by Professor Zheng Yongnian, and he's going to provide us with insightful analysis about dynamics and challenges lying ahead in the context of the current Shangri-LA Security Dialogue.
Over 560 delegates from 52 nations, including 32 official delegations, gather in Singapore's Shangri-La Hotel for Asia's largest security summit. Participants comprise of foreign and defense ministers, senior security officials, military chiefs, the diplomatic community, executives from the corporate and academic sector. A controversial topic, the South China Sea issue. Answering a question posed by a Korean delegate after his keynote speech, Thailand's Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha says we must look beyond obstacles to find common interest.
We must find areas of collaboration to find a solution, so compromises must be made for common interest, for common security.
This year's meeting takes place against the backdrop of growing tensions over the South China Sea, provocations by the North Korean regime led by Kim Jong-un, and renewed concerns over jihadist terrorism. Apart from these discussions, China will introduce its security model, aiming to maintain world and regional stability.
Our main purpose of attending the Shangri-La Dialogue is to spread and introduce President Xi Jinping's security governance concept of building a community of common destiny with Asian features. We will also introduce China's military contribution to global peace, security, and stability, as well as in the Asia-Pacific region.
Welcome to Dialogue, sir.
Thank you.
Over the past 12 months, the tensions in the South China Sea have become more pronounced between all parties concerned. This time around, many in China are wondering aloud if there will be any major breakthrough in seeking a diplomatic solution, or it's more, ironically, it will be more of a hawkish rhetoric from both sides, the United States and China. Now, can I have more of your comments?
Personally, I say no. Situation continue to deteriorate. And indeed, personally, I believe we are entering a very critical stage after the end of the Cold War. We are facing, this region is facing double challenges. The first challenge is caused by geopolitical shift. We have been experiencing the China, the normalization of Japan, the pivot to Asia by the United States. Those are major factors we're experiencing today together. Another more serious challenge is caused by the decline of our political wisdom worldwide. Because every time, if we look back to the world history, when a major geopolitical shift takes place, we need great leadership to reconstruct, remodel world order. So if we look at what's happening in the United States, it's domestic politics. What's happening in the Middle East and even in Europe, in a huge wave of refugee crisis, right? So facing this kind of double crisis or double challenge, we don't have an answer yet. Particular resources for this region. As you mentioned, of course, we recognize the United States is increasingly become an Asia-Pacific power, but it's not a player, major player over the South China Sea issue. But over past years, interestingly, the United States is become a dominant player over South China Sea issue. While on the other hand, the US and China, those two big powers, do not have direct geopolitical conflict. As the Chinese President Xi Jinping mentioned, the Pacific Ocean is big enough to contain, to accommodate two bigger powers.
No, increasingly, many from the United States question the wisdom that the Pacific Ocean is big enough to accommodate the two major powers. This is an election year for the United States, and the same is true with the Philippines. Donald Trump is rising so fast to capture attention.
That's right.
And the whole world wows at his wild rhetoric. Now, do you think he's going to be a game changer? And do you think the newly elected president in the Philippines will also make a sea difference so that there will be a silver lining in seeking a diplomatic solution instead of, being enslaved by, militancy?
That's right. Because actually, if you look at the case of the rise of Donald Trump, he's so popular. While the whole establishment has been against him, right? But he's still so popular. And more people support him. So I think the US established still to think about why he is so popular. Even the new Filipino president, the establishment during election also was against him. But nevertheless, he was elected. That means people in the United States or in the Filipinos are not happy with the situation because those elite.
There's another president-elect in the Philippines, but we'll come back to look at what he says about the future of the bilateral relationship between Manila and Beijing. However, there are different voices coming out of mainland China about the future bilateral relationship between Washington and Beijing. Donald Trump has been a senior business executive, so there's one voice saying, hey, he's going to look at the South China Sea from the perspective of corporate governance. After all, he's going to make money. He's a businessman by nature. He's going to adopt a down-to-the-earth attitude. The other voice is just the opposite. He's taking advantage of the anger and fears in the United States. He's taking advantage of the populism, which is very bad in shaping foreign policy. Which side would you take?
Personally, at this stage, I take the first side. I think the establishment has been criticizing Donald Trump, right? And they are criticizing each other. But as I mentioned, while he is criticized by the establishment, the whole establishment, from both camps, from Democrats, from Republicans, but he's still so popular by the in the eyes of the people, right? So he's a businessman. He's a very pragmatic. Because, for example, like over South China Sea issue, I foresee the U.S. will have to address its policy. Over South China Sea issue, China has built those rocks or islands. China I believe, will continue to build some facilities for civilian users. It will cost China very little. But if not carefully reacted, it will cost the U.S. a whole empire. It will cost the U.S., it involves the U.S. huge cost. The U.S. sent troops, mobilize all kind of sources, put so much energy in this region. But remember, because this is based on what I see, U.S. strategic misjudgment about China. The U.S. regard China's South China policy as the beginning of China's imperialism. But remember, China doesn't have its own version of the Monroe Doctrine. China welcomes the United States to stay here to play a constructive, positive role. China is not pushing the U.S. out. But U.S., according to its own experience, historical experience, it believes China will push the U.S. out. But it's a wrong judgment.
However, whoever becomes the elected leader in the White House next year will have to face this fact, Professor Zheng. the United States never feels that its leadership is being challenged to such a degree, perhaps the end of the Second World War. The second fact is China has the ambition, vision, if not political will, to become a major maritime power. Professor Wang Gengwu, your colleague, said last year exactly the same time, unless China is able to combine its continental power with maritime power, it will not become the next superpower. China is not ready yet to be a superpower, but what Professor Wang Gengwu says makes some sense, right? Don't you think so? And therefore, there's a conflict. There's going to be a conflict between the U.S. political will to maintain its absolute in the Asia-Pacific region and China's will to become a maritime power. Do you foresee the Thucydides trap, the inevitable clashes between the two major powers regarding such an ambitious agenda?
No, I don't think so. Because, first of all, China is not a type of the U.S. power. The U.S. power has been very imperial. The U.S. has been doing a role of so-called world peace for this kind of mission. What China is doing is only for its national defense. I don't think China has a plan to dominate the world, even to dominate the region, right? Of course, China is now a second largest economy. China is the largest trading power. China needs to develop its maritime power, right? Sea power. That's definite. China is determined, has a strong willingness to do so. But that doesn't necessarily conflict with the U.S. as a world policeman.
Let me raise a follow-up question in line with what you said. Secretary Ashton Carter delivered a speech at the Naval Academy recently, comparing the current tensions in the South China Sea to Cold War rival powers, the United States and China. At the same time, Ambassador Cui Tiankai, our ambassador to the United States, also delivered a speech at a think tank in the United States, saying he's afraid the United States is held hostage by Cold War zero-sum game mentality. Do you agree and do you accept this?
Well, not just the Cold War mentality. It has been a part of U.S. imperial history. Even before the Cold War, U.S. before like that, right? It's a historical mentality, It's a permanent mentality of the United States. It's based on its culture. It's a missionary culture, right? If we look at all the speeches made by U.S. Defense Secretary, past months, including this one, I think for the most, he is a good soldier. He's ready to fight for U.S. so-called U.S. national interest, but he's a not good leader, right? As a leader, you have to think about how to prevent the conflict, how to prevent the war from taking place, not just ready to fight, right? So that's a part of what I indicate the decline of political wisdom, among those leaders.
But I'm afraid some Asian scholars in this region argue the other way around against what you say. They say this man, Ashton Carter, Secretary of Defense, is actually a man of reason. Because at the very beginning of his presentation, he said all of the major players, allies, partners, or non-aligned friends in this region, privately or openly expressed their concerns about China's rise and our expansion of the maritime interests here. Do you think what he says has some ring of truth?
No, I don't think so. For example, if you look at it, all big powers have a problem with smaller neighbors. If you look at the United States relationship with its neighbors, for example, Latin America, with Cuba, what happened during the Cold War, or even after the end of the Cold War? China, the relation with its neighbors, very similar with the United States relation with its neighbors, right? China-ASEAN relation is a relationship, it's an asymmetrical relationship. Smaller states fears a big power. That's quite the nature. Look at India, look at Russia. That's universal. Right? So small powers here would like, to invade the United States to balance China. That's quite natural. So whether the region will be in conflict or in peace depends the interaction between China and the United States. But as you mentioned, I think the U.S., particularly Carter, they made a misjudgment. They regard China as the former Soviet Union. That's so different. China is not the Soviet Union. You look at the Cold War area, China and the Soviet Union. What kind of relation would they have? Except mutual nuclear deterrence. What happened? They got nothing. No substantial economic linkage. No substantial political, social linkage. But if you look at China and the United States now, right? If you look at this bigger picture, South China Sea issue is really a tiny issue here. It's not the issue directly between the United States and China, but between China and the U.S. allies. So the U.S., I think, I believe, lost a wonderful opportunity right after the end of the Cold War, because the U.S. continued to practice its older type Cold War, alliance policy, right? After the end of the Cold War, the U.S. should adjust, even abolish this alliance policy, because China now talking about the strategic partnership, right? The U.S. talk about the strategic alliance, but those two concepts are totally different. Strategic partnership, we work together to solve the common problems we are facing. But strategic alliance, you must have an enemy. So that's why that's the U.S. In that sense, I agree with Ambassador Chase, his judgment.
Why is the rest of the world allegedly afraid of China's rise? Do you think this is the media fanfare from the West, or do you think this is a fact?
Yeah, if we look at this region, since the end of the Cold War, the Asia-Pacific region is the most safe world. No major conflict. Look at the Middle East, even look at Europe. Let alone after the fall of the Soviet Union, right? Look into other regions. There's so many conflicts, but here, so far at least, we don't have any major conflict war yet. Why everyone is concerned, security here?
But there is a standoff. There is a standoff between major powers.
No stand. Well, I don't think the U.S. and China, have a standoff. Those two big powers still, they're interacting, on the bilateral front, on international stage. So many. South China Sea issue is a tiny part of this relationship. It's a not good trend, personally I believe. Like we look at it, for example, look at this Shangri-LA dialogue. It has been now for 50 years, right? Since late 1990s, we talk about security. In the 90s, or early stages, the dominant discourse in this region is business, is commerce, is economic cooperation. But now, quickly, the security becomes the dominant discourse of this region. The more we focus on security, do you think now this region is becoming secure or less secure?
Thank you very much. You're watching Dialogue with Professor Zheng Yongnian, Director of the East Asian Institute, National University of Singapore. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us. Welcome back. What do you think of the chance for the Philippines to start a process of reconciliation with the People's Republic of China when the president-elect takes?
Yeah, I would say there will be some change, even major change. And I remember, before the former president, China and the Philippines have been neighbors for so many years, right? But this President Aquino was extremely pro-U.S. wing. So during his tenure, Filipino policy towards China, experienced drastic change. But if you look back in the past 6 years, what the Philippines has gained, What did that country get from China, right? So I think the new leadership is wise enough. The new leadership will do something to address its policy via bilateral talk, which China has insisted. Because over territorial issue, now, the U.S. now is saying, because China is a big power, Filipinos is a smaller power, right? So it's asymmetrical. So China will definitely bully Filipinos. But that's not true. If we look back to look into the case of China and Vietnam, China solved the land dispute with Vietnam. China solved Beibu Gulf, Tonkin Gulf issue with Vietnam. China was a big power. Vietnam was a smaller power. But nevertheless, the two countries peacefully solved the problem. But in the eyes of U.S., a big power will definitely bully a small power. I think if we look at East Asia experience, it's not true, It's not, that is U.S. logic. So I think now, after this, the new president was elected, not just the president himself, other politicians also have arguing, for the Filipinos should beg to engage bilateral talk with China to maintain peace. I think they have a lot of wisdom here.
President-elect Rodrigo Duterte says that his new administration will pursue more independent terms of the foreign policy. Does it mean that he's going to urge the United States to withdraw from the 5 military bases that the Obama administration has negotiated to use? And what's going to happen to the outcome of the international arbitration in The Hague concerning the South China Sea? Because the Aquino administration insisted that it would turn to the international arbitration instead of the dual-track negotiations between China, the Philippines, and between China and ASEAN.
Well, I think President Aquino regards the South China Sea issue as a legal issue. But it was never a legal issue. It always a political issue. So a political issue must be solved politically. So the new president has a good argument. It's a political one. Then let's go back to engage in political dialogue with China to create a good environment first before you can get a good deal. I think that's his wisdom, right? It's very different from President Aquino. But I don't say the new president will have such a radical departure to ask, the U.S. military force to leave Filipinos. I think it's not that simple, because the U.S. really has been dominating, even Filipinos' domestic policy, intervene Filipino domestic policy. The U.S. is not like China. China basically, has insisted the so-called non-intervention policy, but U.S. never has this kind of policy. The U.S. by different means always intervenes smaller states in domestic politics. I don't think Filipinos will be able to just get the U.S. away from its domestic politics. It's not easy.
Both Japan and the United States have adopted a very proactive diplomacy in seeking a solution to the South China Sea. If you look at the statement of the G7 summit meeting, the visit by President Obama to Hanoi, on many occasions, the Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and President Obama tried to highlight the issue of South China Sea in the hope to exaggerate the China threat. On the other hand, China launched a counteroffensive by, for example, issuing a joint declaration between China, Brunei, Cambodia, and Laos, reiterating our common stance towards South China Sea. Some therefore accuse China of trying to split ASEAN, trying to undermine the solidarity of ASEAN in doing so. Now, we have conflicting pictures about the shadow diplomacy, the very proactive diplomatic approach, if it could be called a diplomatic approach. What do you think?
Well, indeed, if there is a great power competition between China on the one hand and the US and Japan on the other hand, and ASEAN will become a victim. ASEAN as an organization, as a collectivity, is very vulnerable, very vulnerable. So the US and the Japan accusing China, exploiting ASEAN. Actually, China can have the same argument. US exploiting ASEAN, right? The same argument, right?
And the United States has lifted the arms embargo against Vietnam. What does that mean?
Yeah, of course. No, that's China.
In theory, Vietnam remains a communist regime,
That's right.
and to say nothing of memories.
That's right. So I think that's due to the very weak leadership of President Obama. Look at this G7 meeting. President Obama, in my eye, is kidnapped by Abe, Prime Minister Abe.
But I'm afraid you have underestimated the capability and the charisma of President Obama, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for talking smart about peace, for calling for a nuclear-free world.
Well, you can argue this is even the Nobel Law is very political, right? I don't buy this argument, but here we must be aware, Japan has its own agenda, which is different from the United States. As I already mentioned, Japan now is seeking the normalization of Japan, right? If Japan becomes a normal state, it must be independent from the United States. Japan must seek its own geopolitical influence. Where can Japan get in Northeast Asia? Only Taiwan, is a sort of possibility. But China definitely can deter that. So what Japan can do, it's a geopolitical space, is Southeast Asia, Filipinos, Vietnam, or some other countries. So we have to be very cautious when we see the U.S.-Japan alliance, particularly in South China Sea issue. Japan is making use of U.S.-Japan alliance to seek its own purpose. I hope our American friend can see this.
Are you suggesting that the issue of nationalism is a threat, not the man-made threat concerning the South China Sea?
Yeah, I believe so. Populism, nationalism, a lot of irresponsible political leaders, they play up nationalism, populism. But the business actually is as usual. If you look at the business side, right? For example, China and the Filipinos, China and the Vietnam, over the past years, their political relationship, diplomatic relationship, not ideal, very bad, very cold. But China does not cut off its economic linkage with the Filipinos, does not cut off its economic linkage with Vietnam. Their commercial business ties continue to grow. So China is not the United States. If you look at China, if you look at the United States' relation with Cuba, the U.S. cut off its relation fully with Cuba, imposed economic sanctions for half of the century. What China does, we see a total different kind of power.
Perhaps very much like those from Texas. They examine things in black and white terms. Thank you very much, Professor Zheng, for talking with us. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.